I originally recorded this video about 2 weeks before 10.1.5 came in. It was originally a video about Blizzard or World of Warcraft's healer problem, but I didn't end up posting it or finish editing it because it ended up just being a video where I just complained about the state of healers. I didn't really have any suggestions to fix the healer problem. All I could really do was point out that there was a problem and what I thought the base causes of that problem were. Now, how did I know that there was a problem? Or how do I know that there's still a problem, although it's less pronounced now in 10.1.5? Well, DPS was sitting in solo queues for 45 minutes, maybe an hour, because no healers really wanted to play the game. Or at least fewer healers wanted to play the game than had in previous seasons. And that was at least evident and quite obvious for PvP. Just from queue times. But then in the, let's say, couple of months leading up to 10.1.5, that same kind of issue started cropping up in other areas of the game. So Mythic Plus, it was quite common to sit in queue for a while by Mythic Plus standards, 10, 20, even 30 minutes, just waiting for a healer to fill the group. As I was making notes for the video and recording the original video, I was looking for group or Mythic Plus keys at various times throughout the day, and I always saw the same thing: groups with tanks and DPS, but no healers. Every single group I saw was waiting for a healer to fill. So those were the big kind of obvious consequences of what I considered to be a healer shortage in World of Warcraft. Now, I was also one of those people, especially prior to 10.1.5. I went from doing hundreds of keys a season as a healer to doing none. From doing hundreds of rounds of solo shuffle, or at least threes arena as a healer, to doing none. I haven't raided for the better part of a decade, so the raiding side of healing is unknown to me. From what I've seen and talked to with my friends and guildies and stuff, it actually seems like raid healing is in quite a good spot. At least prior to 10.1.5, most healers were pretty viable. They all had their kind of niches and quirks around how you play each particular healer, which I think made them quite fun. You could take pretty much any healer into a raid and do pretty well. So I think the healer shortage that I'm talking about didn't really affect raid. I also think that raid encounters are designed quite well now, in Dragonflight at least, in that there are some healing check bosses and there are some quite fun things for healers to do. They're not just standing there, pumping a 3-button damage rotation all day like they were in previous expansions. Now, prior to 10.1.5, I had outlined what is the problem with healers, or what is causing the healer shortage, down to the fact that it felt like all, or at least the vast majority of the responsibility for a group's success, both in PvP, like Arena or Solo Queue, and in Mythic Plus keys, rested squarely on the healer's shoulders. And in combination with that, healing also felt less powerful than it had in a long time, like multiple expansions. I also think that healers are now the role with the least room for error. It actually started all the way back in, I think, Shadowlands with the mana drinking change, but the one that really stands out the most is with the launch of Dragonflight, Blizzard nerfed healing globally across the board throughout the game by 40%. And they did that by increasing health and increasing incoming damage taken, but leaving the power of heals the same. When Dragonflight launched, Blizzard also buffed dampening to make it reduce healing more than it had in previous expansions. And then again in 10.1, Blizzard did the same thing they did at the start of Dragonflight in the beta, which was another global healing nerf, but this time by 25% rather than 50%. Just prior to 10.1.5, Blizzard also nerfed DPS off healing substantially to try and shift more of the healing burden onto the healing role, because what had become quite common practice was groups, especially in Mythic Plus, would bring DPS capable of off-healing a group to every key. Shadow Priests with Vampiric Embrace, Shamans with Ancestral Guidance, Druids with Nature's Vigil, and so on. Now, I think the nerfs overall, in general, were Blizzard's response to a gameplay issue rather than a balance issue. And by that I mean, I think Blizzard nerfed healing in an attempt to make healers spend more time healing rather than doing damage. Because what had become common practice, particularly towards the end of Season 1, was that healers would be there to heal a couple of pain points in a dungeon, but then, for 80 or 90% of a key, they would really just be playing a pseudo DPS with 3 buttons or so. To address this, Blizzard nerfed healing. Now the idea is that healers have to spend more globals moving health bars back up, and they have to rely more heavily on cooldown healing to get through the very damage-intensive phases of fights, particularly in Mythic Plus. Now, I think it fixed the problem. It took much of the emphasis of doing damage off healers, and I think especially with the dungeons that came into the rotation in Season 2, healing, as in Mythic Plus again in particular, it really felt like healing had become healing. You weren't really there to just press a couple of cooldowns and do damage, you were there to keep the group alive through a dungeon. Now the problem with all of this is it made healing significantly more stressful and difficult, to the point that many healers either stopped playing or rolled to a different role or chose to participate in different content that wasn't as stressful. Funnily enough, I've been grinding my way slowly towards Honor level 500, and I actually saw, while doing quite a lot of battlegrounds and epic battlegrounds, there was no shortage of healing in those environments whatsoever. It was quite common to go into an epic battleground and have 15 healers on a side. I think in one of the ones I did while I was recording the original video, we had 21 healers in an epic battleground on one side. So there are still a lot of people healing, but I think a lot of people aren't healing the stressful content in the game, the solo shuffle, Arena 3s, Mythic Plus, particularly those environments where there's one person healing. I also noted in the original video that the healing nerfs have left healing in a state that feels, like I said, very stressful and difficult, but also with many of the conditions required for success or required to keep a group alive being outside the healer's control. And I think that's probably one of the parts of healing, especially prior to 10.1.5, that made healing feel as bad as it did. The primary reason, I would say, because there were a lot of debuffs in keys that can't just heal through. You need the person with the debuff to press a defensive or use a health potion or a health stone, or you need to have other ways of living through mechanics that, like I said, are outside of your control. It's the same case in PvP. This has been actually the case for quite a while, probably since the launch of Shadowlands, in that PvP offensive cooldowns are much more powerful than healing cooldowns. PvP offensive cooldowns are so powerful that they can't be healed through. World of Warcraft PvP used to be a game where having a healer freecast was considered a mistake. You were losing if that was happening. But these days in modern World of Warcraft, kicking a healer, stunning a healer, cross-crowd controlling a healer, a lot of that really doesn't matter in many cases. Your damage can be so overwhelming with offensive cooldowns that a free-casting healer isn't going to stop someone from dying. And again, this might be healthy for the game in some other ways, but it feels terrible for the person whose job it is, or at least feels like their job it is in most of these group situations, is to keep other people alive. And when someone dies and you're healing, you always feel responsible. Even if there's nothing you could have done about it, even if they stood in the fire, you still feel like you've failed because they've died. In Mythic Plus keys in particular, and from 10.1 onwards, I think Mythic Plus keys have become more analogous to Mythic raiding. Whereas in previous expansions and seasons, I would have said the gearing up level keys, so at the moment keys from like level 1 to 16 or 17, I believe, I would have likened to heroic raiding kind of difficulty. And now it feels like Mythic Plus keys, all levels, are basically almost Mythic raiding level of commitment. You need to know what you're doing. You need to be able to play your class pretty well. You need to go into most of these dungeons with a plan. Going into some keys without Mass Dispel or Bleed Dispel, going into keys or without Bloodlust or Battle Res, or without making a group with a strategy in mind. It's very easy to fail keys now. In previous expansions, I would have said Mythic Plus keys, like I said, the kind of gearing up keys, the non-push keys, would have been similar to heroic raids in that you could take pretty much any group of 5 people into a key, and as long as you all avoided the obvious and egregious mistakes, you could succeed and time keys without too much difficulty. But now it's more like you have to go into keys with particular group compositions. You need bleed dispels, you need DPS dispels, mass dispels, you need bloodlust, battle res. You have to utilize most of your utility at the right times and defensives at the right times. You probably want to go in with health pots. invis pots, even in low keys, not having these things can almost guarantee a bricked key. Now, the reason why I didn't post this original video is because this is about as far as I got. I had complained a lot and outlined many of the problems as I saw them, but I didn't have any good ways on how to fix this or what Blizzard was going to do to kind of turn this around. 10.1.5 really surprised me in this regard. And I don't think it's just augmentation being added, although that is a huge bonus to healers. I think the Holy Paladin rework was a huge deal, and I think there's a little bit more to it than it might seem on face value. I might be overthinking Blizzard's intent here, but it seems to me like prior to 10.1.5, most healers, especially in PvP and especially in Mythic Plus, like small content where only one person is healing, a lot of healing throughput was tied up in cooldowns. Preservation Evokers, Discipline Priests, Holy Priests, Mistweavers, pre-10.1.5 Holy Paladins, Resto Shamans, and Druids. All healers got a significant amount of their throughput through cooldowns, or at least to put this another way, they relied on their cooldowns heavily to get through healing checks. And I wonder if one of the reasons why Blizzard reworked Holy Paladins the way they did is because they understand that healing can be quite a punishing role, especially when a lot of power comes from cooldowns. So misplaying a single cooldown can be a huge deal, or just an entirely bricked key. And I wonder if they have reworked Holy Paladins with this in mind, because the new 10.1.5 Holy Paladins have so much of their healing power and throughput baked into their rotational abilities now that they can press their cooldowns, but in many cases they don't need them to the same extent that other healers need them. The Holy Shock getting 2 charges is a huge part of this. I think it was quite well known or agreed upon that in previous iterations of Holy Paladin, it could often feel like it did absolutely no healing, and then when you press your cooldowns, you did a huge amount of healing. I remember thinking this, and I think criticizing Holy Paladin for this, back in Season 1 with Ruby Life Pools. There were quite a lot of situations in those kind of keys that had high healing checks, that if you had all your cooldowns rolling, you felt okay. And then as soon as your cooldowns dropped off, you felt completely powerless. I think 10.1.5 Holy Paladin is almost the opposite of that. A lot of the power of wings has been taken out with the reduction of the power of wings, from I think 20 or 25% down to 15 healing, damage, and critical strike chance. A similar nerf to Avenging Wrath has taken some of the power out of that cooldown. And then, like I said, the rather large buffs to the rotational abilities of Holy Paladins. The Holy Shock on 2 charges, the enormous Glimmer buff, and so on. The result is that Holy Paladin feels like a healer now where you're not overly reliant on cooldowns to move health bars. Holy Shock feels like it's almost always available. Glimmer of Light does a huge amount of healing. When things go wrong or when you really need healing, right now, you always have Divine Toll or Daybreak. There are buttons you can press as a Holy Paladin now that can get you out of terrible situations that I don't think other healers can do. I also think it's quite fair to say that it isn't just a Holy Paladins being a little bit numerically overtuned right now. I think their playstyle in general is less reliant on cooldowns, more rotational throughput, and less constraints, especially with mobility. Paladins can do quite a lot of healing while running around and just spamming instants, which feels great. And I think the end result of all of this is Holy Paladin now feels like it is by far the least punishing healer to make a mistake on. So like I said, I could be reading way too much into this, but I wonder if Blizzard saw the healer shortage, had a general idea of what was causing it or where people were experiencing pain points with it, and tried to update a healer into a much less punishing spec. On top of all that, there is also the elephant standing over in the corner, which is augmentation. Augmentation can really add 15 or so % power, just raw throughput, main stat, to a healer. Having an augmentation evoker in the group without considering their utility, having Zephyr or the group wall and things like that, just the raw stat increase it gives healers in Mythic Plus keys, it basically undoes the 10.1 nerf for healers, which is huge. So the reworked Holy Paladin, on top of that, on top of mages being quite the meta DPS spec at the moment, which gives healers another 5% intelligence buff or main stat buff, means that 10.1.5 has undone some of the recent nerfs to healing, which has made healing feel much better in some situations, some keys. Obviously, if you're not playing a Holy Paladin or you don't have an augmentation evoker in the group, you're going to feel much less powerful than a healer that does, or a Holy Paladin that does. I mentioned at the start of this very long rant that I was a healer who went from doing hundreds of keys a season to none, and hundreds of rounds of solo queue or arena 3s to none. Unfortunately, that is still the case. I'm doing quite a lot of keys at the moment, but I'm not doing it as a healer. I'm probably going to get back into that soonish, but I'm also quite interested this season in trying to push keys as both a healer and a DPS and try and get some comparison down. I will say from my first week of playing DPS in keys ever, it is much more enjoyable just because it's much less stressful. I can go into keys with an understanding that I'm going to learn that key. I don't have to play perfectly. I can mistime my cooldowns, or I can make a couple of mistakes and it won't be the end of the world. Whereas going into some of those keys as a healer with a similar mindset would have been a certainly bricked key. So that has been quite nice, but I will have much more to talk about the difference between healing content and DPSing content in the near future. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching, and algorithm stuff.